So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks a lot for GE staff for inviting me. So I will speak to you about the impact of the user interface design on patient safety, and especially on the way we should evaluate it. I have several conflicts of interest, but none with the study I will present you. So we all know that a very long way has been done between the first human interface and now. But we also know that there's a lot of work to do to get better than that. First, when we want to choose our ventilator, we should always ask the question about the ergonomy, just because technology is always quite the same in between the ventilator, at least if we just look at the standard ventilatory modes. So, what should be an optimal HMI? It clearly depends on the task you are considering. There are some very easy to use devices for very specific and dedicated tasks, but these devices, nobody wants to use them. There are also very optimal HMI, everybody wants them, but when we look at standardized scenario task completion, nobody can use them just because they are too beautiful but too much complicated than they can be used. But in fact, the concept of ergonomy is quite complicated. I just put you a slide. It's not a device, it's an old medication that is no more sold. It was the user notice that was going to be released, a single product, different people that were looking at the notice, different personalities of the readers, different filters, different understanding, and of course many different ways to approach the interface. There were several regulatory problems, several ways to read what was inside the notice. So nobody will have exactly the same way to understand the ergonomy of the device. So we should, when we try to evaluate the ergonomy, we should take into account all these different types of interrogations. So what is exactly ergonomy, in fact? Ergonomy is supposed to be the study of the human-to-tool relationships. It is meant to help design machine, and I think it's the most important part, that will help most people to do that task. Not only expert, but most people. It will help them do their task with an optimal comfort of use, an ease of use, and of course we should also achieve safety and efficiency. So if we just look at the old standard, we usually only consider the technology of the device. We usually only consider chronometric evaluation of very specific tasks. If we only look at these two dimensions, we will fail in our ergonomy evaluation. If we want to achieve our goal, we need to look at the ease of use. The device has to be used by everybody, by most people. So the best way to test that is to test it on naive subject, non-expert at all, they don't know the device at all. We have also to evaluate the tolerance to error, so we need to perform some chronometric evaluation of very specific and standardized scenarios. We also have to evaluate the engagement of the physician, of the worker with the tasks they are doing, and for that we mainly use psychocognitive scale and especially mental workload evaluation such as the NESA-TLX and the SUS. But we also look at some very specific physiological parameters, of course heart rate, respiratory rate, but also heart rate variability, which is a good way to approach emotional excitation. And sometimes, of course, we will also look at the efficiency, and that's a place where we are doing the technical bench testing. But technical bench testing is only a part of the global evaluation of the device. And sometimes we also do some eye tracking. Of course, we can look at these separated dimensions, but most of all these dimensions are intercorrelated, so we must perform these 4-dimension evaluation together if we want to achieve efficacy evaluation. But always we should also have a second look after a long-term use, which gives us very different answer to our question. So we will perform cognitive ergonomy, but what is cognitive ergonomy? Cognitive ergonomy is looking at the behaviors of the physician when they are performing their task. We need to perceive the world to act, but sometimes we also need to act to understand the world and especially to understand the device we are using correctly. So that's a reason why bench testing in our laboratory will never be sufficient to achieve safety evaluation. We mainly use what we call usability lab, which is not a new concept. It's used for years and years in the industry. We mainly look at video recordings, sound recordings, screen. We are just behind the screen looking at what the physicians are doing when they are performing the task. And we are looking afterwards at some psychocognitive evaluation and evaluation of the physiological sensor. Of course, all these evaluations are performed in our simulation center. You can see some slides of the look of our simulation center, which is a quite standard. We are just putting the physician in their quite normal way of living, quite normal way of doing their task, and then we evaluate the device in their standard situation of work. We are doing some very specific also evaluations, such as the heat mapping, where we are looking specially at screens. We are doing some HRV and conductometry evaluation. But most of all, what I think it gives us the best input should be the mental workload evaluation that is performed by the NASA TLX. NASA TLX is a psychocognitive scale that was launched in the early 1980s by the NASA just to evaluate the spaceship interface. There are three dimensions that are focused on the constraint imposed to the subject by the task, and 3 other dimensions that are imposed to the subject because of its interaction with the task. We can get a global input, a global evaluation of the mental workload, but we can also just have a look at the very different and separate dimensions. And afterward, we also look at the usability scale. The usability scale is a well-known psychocognitive scale that is used in the industry. And the main interest of the usability scale is that there are already some standards in the literature. We all know that an SUS value of 68 should be the goal of all our devices that we evaluate. It is considered to be acceptable if the SUS value is approximately 50, but I will show some results, some devices are far below than that. So this is our study that was published this year in the Annals of Intensive Care. We just have a look at the interface of all 6 new ICU ventilators. We just took mainly experts physicians. Most of them had a huge time of work within the ICU, approximately 11 years working in the ICU. They were coming from 4 different ICU, medical and surgical ICU, but they are all one characteristic. They were all using a standard device that was the AVEA from VISIS that was no longer commercialized, and we just used the AVEA as a gold standard as a reference. The most important thing is that within our technical bench testing, all devices, when considering standard volume control or pressure control modes, were quite equivalent. There was no significant differences in between the device. So we therefore just mainly focus on the ergonomy of the devices. What we have done is just looking, just as I told you, some physiological parameters, video recording, video analysis, and especially automated pupillar diameter evaluation, which is also a very fancy way to approach emotional excitation. Here is a raw data of all the devices that were evaluated. On the left column, you can see the successful achievement of the task, and the blue bar is the time that was required to achieve the task. The devices are at the left, and you can see here the scenario that was to be performed. What we can look at that, depending on the scenario, there were very different way of achievement for the physician. Some were doing very bad, and some other were doing very well. But we can say also that even within the scenarios that were successful for all physicians, some scenarios were performed with a very short period within a very short period of time, whereas some were performed within a very large period of time. We just perform at least 10 scenarios evaluation. We just try to classify the devices in between them. And afterwards, we went to the psychocognitive scale. Here is the evaluation of the usability of the devices. Our reference device at the highest value, much more than the gold standard of 68. Which is considered to be a good device. This may also mean that experience of the physician has a huge impact on the usability of the device. And we were able to classify the devices in between them. We therefore went, just a moment, as you can see on the slide, not a single device did achieve the goal of 68. Which is considered in the industry as the best way to release a good device on the market. We then went to the mental workload assessment. The best mental workload is to get the lowest value. The lowest value means that the device does not need a huge mental workload for the physician. And you can see we are also able to classify the devices in between them. Some did imply a very high mental workload, while several other did imply a very low mental workload. So the lowest and nasal-TLX the best. As I told you earlier, we can also just have a look not on the global evaluation of the mental workload, but also the different dimensions that we are looking at. And the most important when looking at the different dimensions is that how can I improve my ergonomy? And here you can see that the smaller the area, the lowest is the mental workload, so the best is the device. But we can also look at the dimensions that are responsible for the increase of the mental workload. Just looking at this device is probably not the best device in terms of ergonomy, just because it demands a huge amount of performance and physical effort to achieve the task. We had also looked at some physiological parameters, just looking at the activation of these physiological parameters. What is an activation? Activation is a significant difference in between the topic we are looking at, which means that respiratory rate activation means that there was an increase or a decrease minus or plus 10% of the initial value. And you can see that we were also able to depict very significant differences in between all the devices. Our gold standard, our reference value devices had quite always the lowest value, which means that whatever the parameters that we were looking at, it was not inducing a huge amount of emotional excitation, which means that physicians were most of the time confident with the results. We just look at the respiratory rate activation, heart rate activation, tidal volume activation, which means that when we are performing some task, we are increasing our own tidal volume. The most stress we are getting, the most breathing we are going on. We also had a look on pupillar diameter activation, which was also a very fancy way to approach emotional activation. As you can see afterward, we have a huge amount of different parameters to choose the best device in terms of ergonomy. We did not have enough time to evaluate the light levels of the screen, which may be a very important approach of the ergonomy. Some devices are very fancy, but with a high level of high luminosity, which may decrease the sleep of the patient. We did not have time to perform heat mapping, neither video or auto or hetero evaluation, neither verbatim. So in conclusion, technical bench testing is important. Standardized scenario evaluation is also important, but they are not sufficient to isolate the best and the safest device. Ergonomy is now a major component of the efficacy, and it should never be dissociated from the technical evaluation. And a lot remains to be done for all devices, even for the best devices that did not reach the high standard of industry. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the floor? Please go to the microphone. Maybe I can start. Very nice results and presentation. You tested that the people were used with your own ventilator, and now they were, for the first time, had the contact with the other ventilator. Is probably because we are very used to use our mobile phone. Is it maybe possible that the best ergonomy is that ventilators who had the same screens or the handling of the screens like our mobile phones, or?
I'm not sure of that. I will show you that the first devices that we use, it's an emergency ventilator. It's a very, very fancy ventilator. It just looked like a smartphone. It was subjectively considered as the best device by all emergency physicians that tested the device. But it was also the baddest in terms of performance and efficiency, just because it was probably too much complicated to use. All the user manuals were inside. There were also a lot of videos of helps, but probably too complicated for that.
Okay.
And a contrario, these very bad-looking devices are very efficient, just because one button, one task. So the best of the world should probably in between.
The simplicity.
Fancy, but also simple.
Yeah. Okay, other questions? Maybe here from the floor.
Yeah, I wonder what would happen if you actually would repeat the test after giving people enough time to get exposed to a ventilator, whether that would change the performance. Because we also get used to use our ventilators, and I perceive as a barrier to safety the fact that you may have very different brands of ventilator in the unit.
That's an important thing to tell. That's the reason why we also included a reference devices that were used by all physicians. Of course, after 10 years using the same ventilator, we are very confident with it. We know all the tricks. We know where to go if you want one thing. But the problem is, within a staff, there are a lot of people coming in, coming out. It will take a huge time to become confident with the device. And that's the time when safety issues happens. So we don't want to wait 1 year being confident with the device. We should get the devices that is the safest when we launch it.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, Erwan, that's really interesting, and maybe opening a new era to choose the devices. So would you recommend to the administratives, for instance, in the hospital, to systematically apply such an approach when we want to buy a respirator, an echo machine, a monitor, whatever the devices?
I'm totally convinced that what we are doing on a routine basis, just testing a device within 15 days is has no mean, totally no means. We just get subjective outputs. We just look at the most fancy device. We just look at the devices that gives up the best option, but not the real function. So I'm quite sure we should always use very standardized bench testing to choose the one.